Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. Our book is The World of Philosophy, an Introductory Reader by Cahn, and we're going over Stephen Cahn's article in this video on page 48, What is Reason?, which he wrote with Patricia Kitcher and George Scher, and this addresses Exam 1, Part A, Question 3, What is an argument? How are they used in reasoning? Explain. So if you answer this question, this is the article you want to refer to. So an argument. What is an argument? This is kind of a trick question. An argument is not quarreling, two people yelling at each other and fighting. It is, on page 48, an argument is a collection of sentences consisting of one or more premises and a conclusion. So that's what an argument is. You state a claim, you make a truth claim, and then based on that premise, you draw some conclusion. So, and we'll read some examples here from the book. And so there's two types of arguments, deductive arguments and inductive arguments. So deductive arguments, this, on page 49, the central concept of deductive logic is validity. An argument is valid if and only if the following relation holds between premises and its conclusion. So here it is in italics. It is impossible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true. So an argument is valid. A deductive argument is valid if it is impossible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true. So, and I'm going to read some of these examples, but here's an important point. They say, it makes no sense to say that a statement is valid, for validity is a relation among statements. Statements can be true, but not valid. Arguments can be valid, but not true. So a statement, can be true. I am giving a video about Stephen Cahn's article right now. That's a statement. It can be true, it is true, or it could be false. An argument is the relation between statements. I'm giving a video about Stephen Cahn right now. My students will see this video posted on the website, therefore they will watch it. That is not necessarily true, because you might not watch it. It's possible for that argument to say, that is an invalid argument because it's not necessarily true that just because I'm giving this video, you guys are going to watch it. So at any rate, I'm going to just, to clarify, read what they say. Statements can be true, but not valid. Arguments can be valid, but not true. So here's some examples on page 49. Wombats belong to the order of marsupials. Koalas belong to the order of marsupials. Wombats and koalas belong to the same order. So there's two premises. Wombats are marsupials. Koalas are marsupials. And then from that premise, the conclusion is wombats and koalas belong to the same order. So to test for the validity of a deductive argument, and I know this can get tedious, but this is the nuts and bolts of analyzing arguments. On the bottom of page 49, a valid argument is one whose conclusion cannot be false if its premises are true. Okay, so it's valid if so let's just test it. Wombats and koalas belong to the same order. So let's test this. Is this a valid deductive argument? Let's just say wombats and koalas do not belong to the same order. Is it possible to say that and have the premises 1 and 2 still be true? Wombats belong to the order of marsupials. Koalas belong to the order of marsupials. No, it's not possible. They do belong to the same order. Those are the premises. So if you say the conclusion is false, then the premises must also be false. So again, in one sense, this is the bottom of 49, the test for validity comes right out of the definition of validity. A valid argument is one whose conclusion cannot be false if its premises are true. All right, so here's an example of another type of argument that's not valid. Page 50, all Englishmen love the Queen, which is false. Not every Englishman loves the Queen. Henry is English. Henry loves the Queen. It's a valid argument, if all Englishmen actually do love the Queen, and if Henry is English, then it must necessarily be true that Henry loves the Queen. But the reason that that valid argument is not true is because the premise is not true. All Englishmen love the Queen. All right, so he goes through some other examples, and that is, I'm not going to get into them. I'm giving you just a very basic framework. This one is, if you read it, then you'll get it. It's not open for too much interpretation. So from deductive arguments, we go on to non-deductive arguments, which is, for the most part, induction. So I'm going to start over on page 51, the right-hand column. Without any detailed knowledge of combustion, we know that if we place a dry piece of paper into the flame of a candle, the paper will burn. We know this because we have witnessed or heard about many similar events in the past. In the past, the paper has always burned, so we infer that the paper will burn in the present case. This common type of reasoning is called induction. In induction, one relies on similar observed cases to infer that the same event or property will recur in an as yet unobserved case. So deductive arguments start with a general statement and then infer some more particular instance. So all Englishmen love the Queen. That's very general. Henry is English, therefore Henry loves the Queen. That's a deductive argument. It's not true, but this argument is valid because if you assume the premises are true, then that conclusion must necessarily be true. For induction, you start with instances and you work to a general conclusion. It's deductive argument is from the general to the particular. Induction is from the particular to the general. In the past, every instance that you try to put a piece of paper in a candle flame, it lit on fire. So from that, each of those individual particular observations, you can infer that if I take, any piece of paper and put it in any fire anywhere, it will probably light on fire. But that's the key word there is probable. You can't be absolutely certain using inductive arguments that the conclusion must necessarily always come from the premise. It is most likely that every time you put a piece of paper in fire anywhere, it'll light on fire. But you can't be absolutely certain because you're building it just on the way things have occurred in the past. This is a fundamental philosophical question. Just for a little insight, I'm going to skip ahead to Leibniz, Gottfried Leibniz on page 72. So this is going to become important when we get to the articles about rationalism and empiricism. So I'll just read this briefly. On the left-hand column, page 72, that raises another question, namely whether all truths depend on experience, that is, on induction and instances, or if some of them have some other foundation. For if some events can be foreseen before any test has been made of them, it is obvious that we contribute nothing from our side. Although the senses are necessary for our actual knowledge, they are not sufficient to provide it all, since they never give us anything but instances, that is, particular or singular truths. But however many instances confirm a general truth, they do not suffice to establish its universal necessity, for it does not always follow that what has happened will always happen in the same way. From this, it appears that necessary truths, such as we find in pure mathematics, and particularly in arithmetic and geometry, must have principles whose proof does not depend on instances, nor consequently on the testimony of the senses. So just what do these definitions of deductive arguments and inductive arguments have to do with philosophy? It's going to has a lot of bearing on the question of what is knowledge that we're going to get into pretty soon here. Okay, so since an inductive argument doesn't give you absolute, certain, universal, necessary truth, it gives you probable truths. And the strength of an inductive argument gives you more and more confidence. The more instances of a particular type of event that you can provide to support your argument, your claim, then the more confidence you'll have in that argument. They give an example of you move into a new town and every bus you see is green, so you assume that all the buses in the town are green, and that argument becomes stronger the more instances of it that you find. The more green buses you see, oh, okay, and the more parts of the town you visit, so the wider your sample of evidence, the more confidence you can have in that kind of an argument. But even one instance that contradicts the argument destroys the whole chain of reasoning. If you see a red bus one day and it's from that city, well, then not all the buses are green. You've seen one. You know what? I'm going to actually give another couple examples that they provide in the book. Page 51, the left-hand column. So, in 100,000 trials, drug X produced no serious side effects. Drug X does not have any serious side effects, so that is not a deductive fact, because on the 101st trial, drug X might produce a side effect. But the more trials you give of the drug without any side effects, the more confidence you can have that most likely the drug does not have negative side effects. And here's another one. Here's a mundane example of the left-hand column. The dining room window is shattered. Premise 1. There is a baseball lying in the middle of the glass on the dining room floor. Premise 2. There is a baseball bat lying on the ground in the yard outside the dining room. That's premise 3. And so the conclusion is the dining room window was shattered by being hit with a baseball. Now, that's a pretty good assumption, but it's not a deductive argument. It could have been something else. It could have just been a bunch of coincidences. And, if somebody hit your window with a rock, the rock's in the corner, you don't see it. They ran up there to try to find the rock to cover their evidence. They just so happened to be playing baseball earlier. They dropped the baseball, which they had in their hand. It is conceivable that there's another explanation. So you would say the way to make that a strong inductive argument would be simply by adding the word probably. The dining room window was probably shattered by being hit with a baseball. Yeah, it probably was. Not absolutely certain. All right, so they talk about hypothesis testing and inference to the best explanation, which get into some more subtle aspects of deductive and inductive reasoning, but I'm going to skip over to argument analysis, page 53. So we have examined various types of inference. Now we will consider how this information may be used in analyzing reasoning. The basic task of argument analysis is to provide a clear formulation of the chain of argumentation presented in a piece of prose. So, the best critic works hard at finding the optimal version of the argumentation contained in a passage before evaluating it. So, for example, if you were watching a political debate, you would analyze what a politician said. What is the argument that this politician is making? And you would try to give it the best version you can, because you can assume that there might be some rhetoric and potential unannounced assumptions that are slipped in there. So to analyze an argument, you try to put the argument in its clearest form that you can find. So continuing, while it may seem surprising, the first step in evaluating a piece of reasoning is to find the conclusion. The conclusion may occur at the beginning, or at the end, or in the middle of the passage. Often the conclusion will not be stated at all. So, what is the author trying to get us to believe? And then you try to find the premises that lead to that conclusion. And so you need to trace a plausible route from the premises to the conclusion. The stage is frequently the most difficult. Often it will be necessary to try several alternative reconstructions before you are satisfied that you have found the argument buried in the prose. So you delete unnecessary rhetorical flourishes, and then you clarify the meaning of key terms. So that's what you do when you're analyzing arguments. What are the key terms? What's this person trying to get me to believe? What are the starting points of their argument, the premises? And then if you can list that out clearly, you can analyze the strength of the person's argument. And the meaning of key terms is another important philosophical point, because it may be impossible to ever give a perfect definition of any term. I'm going to go back to page 50 here. So a valid argument doesn't necessarily have to be true, as we saw with deductive reasoning. If the premise is true, then the conclusion of a deductive argument must necessarily be true. But how do you know if the premise is true? So unfortunately, there's no magical device we can use to determine truth. For philosophers, as for anyone else, establishing the truth of claims is often a complex, difficult, and uncertain project. So, what is truth? How do you prove something is true? You give a good reason for why you believe that. Okay, but why did you choose that reason? What supports that reason? And you have to have another reason. So one problem is that can lead to what's called an infinite regress of reasons. Here's my reason for believing this reason for believing my truth claim. And then it can go on forever. Or it goes into circular reasoning, which is, for example, I believe premise A because of premise B. I believe premise B because it's supported by premise C. And I believe premise C because it's supported by premise A. So that's called circular reasoning. All right, so having taken account of that, the authors say that on page 54, evaluating reasoning is a complex task because human language is rich and fluid, and because we are unable to see a large number of subtle connections among the facts we confront. While the task is difficult, the alternative is unacceptable, for if we give up trying to understand reasoning, then we must either naively accept the arguments of others as if we were children, or play the cynic and forswear the possibility of learning from the insights of others. So that is, what is an argument? How are they used in reasoning? So if you answer that question, just make sure you bring in excerpts from this article.